Hello and welcome once again. In the third segment of my video on Gayatri Spivak's essay Can the Subaltern Speak, I had given a somewhat detailed description of the first part of the essay. I hope to cover the second part in this session. Spivak had begun the essay by critiquing the views expressed by the post-structuralist intellectuals Foucault and Deleuze with respect to the role of intellectuals and how they have in actuality reinscribed the imperial premises when instead of dismantling the presumptions of colonial studies. According to Foucault and Deleuze, the subalterns can represent themselves and that the intellectuals only need to provide the conditions whereby the subalterns can speak and act. In this context, Spivak discusses the two types of representations and concludes the first session by establishing that the intellectuals are incapable of leaving that Eurocentric approach and they are also equally responsible for the constitution of the other as a mere shadow of the self. The second part of the essay discusses the aspect of epistemic violence as exemplified in the remotely masterminded plans to constitute the colonial subject as other. To elaborate this point, Spivak proceeds to an analysis of the foundations of the British codification of Hindu law. She particularly chose this as the subject because of her familiarity, because of her Indian nativity and upbringing, and also because of her familiarity with Indian languages. At the same time, she also wants to make it clear that she is aware of the fact that the Indian case does not represent all countries or cultures that are considered the other of Europe. Gayatri Spivak then proceeds to clarify the epistemic violence of the codification of Hindu law and also concludes her discourse with a discussion of Hindu widow sacrifice. Hindu law functions on the basis of four texts that represent a four-part episteme. First is Shruti, what you have heard. Second, Smriti, what you remember. Third, Shastra, what you have learned from another. And fourth is Vyavahara, and what is performed in exchange. So Shruti and Smriti are subject to multiple interpretations because Shruti is what you have heard and Smriti is what you remember. So naturally, they cannot be treated as continuous or identical. Shastra and Vyavahara are dialectically continuous. Spivak says that it was not clear if the fourfold structure described the actual body of law or way of settling disputes. And because of the polymorphous nature of Hindu law, Spivak says that she can use this as an example of epistemic violence. But as nothing much is clear regarding the codification of Hindu law, she thinks that it will be more appropriate to start with the story of Indian education. And she quotes from Macaulay's Minutes. We must at present do our best to form a class who may be interpreters between us and the millions whom we govern. A class of persons, Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. To that class, we may leave it to refine the vernacular dialects of the country, to enrich those dialects with terms of science borrowed from the Western nomenclature and to render them by degrees fit vehicles for conveying knowledge to the great mass of the population. The British law formulation requires to be complemented by the education of colonial subjects. That is, to implement their laws effectively, it was important to separate the tradition of Sanskrit high culture from the native culture. This is because Sanskrit high culture had many aspects that would match the epistemic violence of the British legal project. In this context, Spivak mentions the founding of the Asiatic Society of Bengal in 1784, the Indian Institute at Oxford in 1883, and she also mentions some of the British scholars who were both administrators and also organizers of the matters of Sanskrit. In other words, there was an increasing feudalization of the performative use of Sanskrit in the life of Brahminic hegemonic India. To justify British codification, Brahmins were shown to have the same intentions. The Brahmins also reduced the four text Hindu law into writing and made it more rigid on the pretext of preserving Hindu society. Unfortunately, these are the materials available to the French intellectuals to explore the civilization of the other. According to Foucault and Deleuze, if given a chance, the subalterns can speak and they know their conditions. But this other is actually a motley crew or a varied group. Those in the margins include the illiterate peasantry, tribals, the lowest strata of the urban sub-proletariat. So the question is now whether these categories who go by the term subalterns can actually speak. Antonio Gramsci criticizes the patronizing attitude of the intellectuals with respect to their role in the subalterns' climb along the cultural and political ladder of hegemony. This upward movement or phased development of the subaltern is made more difficult by the imperialist project. The Subaltern Studies group, made up of intellectuals, made a project of rethinking Indian colonial historiography on the basis of the discontinuous chain of peasant insurgencies during colonial administration. Ranajit Guha argues that the historiography of Indian nationalism has been dominated by two types of elitisms, the colonialist elitism and the bourgeois nationalist elitism. The making of the Indian nation and the development of a nationalism were achievements, no doubt, but they were exclusively elite achievements. In the colonialist and neo-colonialist historiographies, these achievements have been credited to the British rulers, and in the nationalist and neo-nationalist writings, they have been credited to Indian elite personalities. Spivak says that what the first world intellectuals know about the other is what the Indian elite have told them. But there lies the problem. The information is not always correct because the colonized subaltern is heterogeneous. Ranajit Guha has constructed a definition of the people as an identity in differential. According to the stratification grid, on the top you have the dominant foreign groups. Just below them is the dominant indigenous groups on the All India level. The third position is taken by the dominant indigenous groups on the regional and local levels, and finally at the bottom you have the people and the subalterns. Now the term is used almost synonymously. They represent the demographic difference between the total Indian population and the total elite. That is, subaltern is the total Indian population minus the total elite population. The third group, or the indigenous elite at the regional or local level, comes in between the subalterns and the macrostructural dominant groups, that is the first and the third. The first is the dominant foreign groups and the second is the dominant indigenous groups on the all India level. So this third group, that is the indigenous groups on the regional or local levels, they are also called the buffer groups because they form the point of separation between the elite and the subalterns. The third group is a heterogeneous group mainly because of regional, economic and social differences depending on the place in which they live. So they could be either dominant or they could also be the dominated. They are the floating buffer zone. The dominant indigenous group at the regional or local level might belong to a social strata hierarchically inferior to the dominant all India groups. The ambiguity arises in identifying the alliance and interests of those who come in the lowest strata, the impoverished landlords, rich peasants, upper middle class peasants. They do not come in the elite category, but at the same time they cannot be called subalterns either, particularly in terms of Guha's definition as representing those who do not come in the elite category. All efforts focus towards this category. The problem issues from this. The intellectuals who believe that the subalterns can speak if conditions are favorable are actually referring to this category who come in between the elite and the subalterns. They do not represent the actual subalterns. They act in the interests of the dominant groups and not in conformity to the interests corresponding truly to their own. So what happens to the real subalterns? How can we touch their consciousness? With what voice consciousness can the subaltern speak? The project of the Intellectuals of a Subaltern Studies group is to rewrite the development of the consciousness of the Indian nation. So consciousness is the knowledge of the interrelationships between different classes and groups. It is here that a developed theory of ideology can be of use. For the interpretation of ideology, it is important to identify what the writings do not say. Spivak calls it the task of measuring silences. That is, when it involves the associated question of the consciousness of the subaltern, the notion of what the literary text cannot say becomes all the more pertinent. Spivak mentions that if the itinerary of the subaltern subject is erased from historiography, the track of sexual difference is doubly erased. The ideological construction of gender always keeps the male dominant. In the context of colonial production, the subaltern has no history and cannot speak, but the female is even more deeply in shadow. Spivak then proceeds to a discussion of the contemporary international division of labor. Even though global recession has slowed trade and investment worldwide since 1979, international subcontracting has actually boomed. Manufacturers based in developed countries subcontract the most labor-intensive stages of production to the third world countries where labor is cheap. As the labor force is spread out, the multinationals are freer to resist militant workers, revolutionary upheavals, and even economic downtrends. Class mobility is extremely slow in comprador countries. Comprador countries are countries that act as agents of foreign organizations, assisting them in economic and political exploitation. The indigenous dominant groups might even find themselves getting attracted to global alliance politics. For example, women of more dominant social groups are more likely to associate themselves with international feminism. But at the other end of the scale are the women of the urban subproletariat. The structure of exploitation is made even worse by patriarchal social relations. Here, the subject of exploitation cannot speak the text of female exploitation. Spivak says that Foucault and Deleuze's idea of the non-representing intellectual making space for her to speak is absurd. This is even worse when they discuss third world issues. When Deleuze mentions subalterns capable of speaking, he has in mind the local or the indigenous elite. A resistance program of alliance politics against repression is limited to the third world groups accessible to the first world. Therefore, Spivak concludes that the localized resistance cannot be an alternative to macrological struggles. It can only complement them. So that kind of covers the second section of the essay. I will be back with the next segment very soon. Thank you so much for watching.